This story goes out to my buddy Peter over in Xiamen. I'm going to tell you a story about the first time I went to Korea. I think it was 1994, probably December. And I was living in Japan. I was living in Ibaraki-ken, Ibaraki Prefecture, and Tsukuba-shi, or Tsukuba City. And this is after living in Japan for a year on a work visa. So, but at this time, I only had a tourist visa, which was 3 months long. So I had to leave after 3 months. So the closest country was and is Japan, is Korea. So I decided to go over and meet some of the Korean students from Sogang University, my university's sister school, that I met the previous summer in Los Angeles. So back then, all we had was landlines. So luckily I had their phone numbers, or a couple of their phone numbers, and we arranged it so they would meet me at the airport. And at that time, the only airport was in Gimpo. It's not the Incheon airport. That didn't even exist. So I left from Tsukuba City, took the bus to the airport, which was, I think it's got to be at least an hour to Narita. And from there, flew to Gimpo. So this would be my second country in Asia that I've ever gone to. And I grew up with one of my best friends being from Korea. So I knew some Korean words, and I knew about Korean culture, generally speaking. So it was pretty interesting. I was like, wow, I'm actually, I'm going to Korea. So it was pretty amazing. Flew over to Korea, and I remember landing and meeting my friends at the airport. And I remember standing outside of the airport, and all I had was Japanese yen. I had ichiman yen. I had probably a few. I probably had at least a few $100s. And I was showing them the money, and they were kind of looking at it like, wow, like they've never seen Japanese money. And they were asking me, we were speaking English, and they were asking me, who's this guy? And I believe it's Natsume Soseki, who's actually a very famous Japanese writer, and he's on the biggest note. So, and I was like, I'm not exactly sure. At that time, I didn't know. And then there was an old man who probably, how old was he? He was probably, at least in his 70s, maybe 75, maybe 80. And he kind of came up next to us, and he was like, oh, this is Natsume Soseki, da da da. And then I started speaking to him in Japanese, and back and forth, Nihongo, that. And then it was like, wow. I was like, wow, I'm in Korea, but there are people who can understand Japanese. This is great. So I was like a fish out of water. At that point, my Japanese was pretty good. Of course, my Korean was, besides food names, I couldn't really say a lot of things. I was just at the airport. I just got there, but it was pretty cool feeling to know that I could speak Japanese with older people, because Japan occupied Korea essentially from 1895 to 1945. So at that point, that was about 1994. So basically that was, let's call it 45? Yeah, about 50 years after. So that man was probably schooled in Japanese up until he was 20 years old. So he was essentially a native Japanese speaker. So when I was in Korea, especially at the beginning, the first year or so, whenever I would have a problem, like I couldn't find something or I, needed help. There were no cell phones back then. Beepers were just about to come out. I would find the oldest person I could on the subway and speak to them in Japanese. And more than likely, we would be able to converse. And, they were just like, they weren't shocked. They were happy, for sure. They were very happy. I think it wasn't even in their realm of possibility that a Westerner, an American, would speak to them in pretty good Japanese. So that was pretty fun. It was pretty fun to watch the reactions of a lot of the younger people, because they were still especially the young people were very anti-Japanese at that time. So when they would see me, a young American, speaking Japanese, their initial reaction was like, ooh, we don't want to hear it. We don't want to hear Japanese, right? But then they would see them speaking to an older gentleman or a lady, and they have a Confucian respect because of age. They could not say anything. They cannot break protocol. So it was kind of a good feeling just to. I know how they feel. They don't, at that time especially, they really didn't like Japanese, but still it was strange for them to see. It didn't happen that many times, but when it did, it was pretty funny to watch. Anyways, that's my story about my first trip to Korea and speaking a bit of Japanese too. Peace.